Presidents Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin are set to meet in Alaska for talks on the war in Ukraine. But concern is increasing in Kyiv and among its European allies over fears of being sidelined. So, what's at stake at the Alaska summit for all sides? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Adrian Finighan. US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin haven't wasted much time arranging a face-to-face talk in Alaska for Friday, just 9 days after it was first suggested. Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, who hasn't been invited, and his European allies have been rushing too, to avoid a deal being done without their involvement. Swift movement on the battlefield. Also, a lightning Russian offensive has won more ground in Donetsk, in a serious setback for Ukrainian forces. And as with nearly everything to do with Trump, there are plenty of conflicting messages. The summit comes after last Friday's deadline for Russia to agree a ceasefire, which hasn't happened. Trump's also suggested giving Moscow control of some Ukrainian territory as a settlement. That's something Kyiv flatly rejects. So, what's at stake for all sides in Alaska, and what will each party be hoping for? We'll discuss all that with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Amma Boateng.
It's been 6 years since US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin last met in person. At a G20 summit in Japan, President Trump spoke of his good relationship with Putin. When Trump took office again in January, he promised to end the Ukraine war within 24 hours. He's threatened Russia with further sanctions, and in May said Putin had gone absolutely crazy after Russia launched its largest air assault on Ukraine. Now, Trump has softened his tone. The two leaders are due to meet in the US state of Alaska on Friday.
I'm going to meet with President Putin, and we're going to see what he has in mind. And if it's a fair deal, I'll reveal it to the European Union leaders and to the NATO leaders, and also to President Zelensky. I think out of respect, I'll call him first, and then I'll call them after. And I may say, lots of luck, keep fighting, or I may say we can make a deal.
Ukraine has not been invited to the summit in Alaska. President Volodymyr Zelensky says he's skeptical of the Russian president's motives for meeting Trump.
He is definitely not preparing for a ceasefire or an end to the war. Putin is determined only to present a meeting with America as his personal victory, and then continue acting exactly as before, applying the same pressure on Ukraine as before.
European leaders, led by Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz, are pushing for their inclusion in any negotiations on ending the war in Ukraine.
We cannot accept that territorial issues between Russia and America are discussed or even decided over the heads of Europeans and Ukrainians. I assume that the American government sees it the same way.
It's been 3.5 years since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kyiv has lost tens of thousands of soldiers, and Moscow is thought to have lost more than 100,000. Sanctions on Russia and diplomacy have so far failed to bring about an end to the war. It's unclear if Friday's highly anticipated meeting will be a turning point. Amma Boateng, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
So let's bring in our guests. From Washington, D.C., we're joined by Anatol Leven, Director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. From Berlin, we're joined by Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. And from Vicenza in Italy, Alex Titov, lecturer at Queen's University, Belfast, and a specialist in Russian foreign policy. Gentlemen, a warm welcome to you all. Anatol, let's start with you. Trump insists that this one-on-one meeting with Putin on Friday will be a feel-out, as he put it, to gauge the Russian president's willingness to compromise. But are European leaders and President Zelensky right to fear that Trump may be lured into agreeing a deal with Putin that involves irretrievable concessions that are simply unacceptable to both President Zelensky and EU leaders?
Well, in the end, if it comes to Ukraine surrendering more territory, Trump can declare himself in favour of that. But of course, Ukraine has to agree to it and will not agree to it, at least not if this involves the maximalist Russian demands for territory. But if Trump restricts himself, as in recent days the White House has been suggesting, to listening to Putin and then carrying whatever he has gained from this to the Ukrainians, then obviously the negotiations will continue. What is true, of course, is that this is taking place over the heads of the Europeans. But then, what exactly are the Europeans themselves proposing? And do the Europeans have a common position to put forward in these talks?
Stephen, Trump appears to have slowly hardened his stance towards President Putin in recent months. What are the chances of that evaporating once he's face-to-face with Putin?
I think there's every chance that they will evaporate. Trump keeps talking about raising the pressure on Putin, but he's signally failed to do so. And it may be, I suspect, Vladimir Putin is no idiot. I suspect he has something attractive he wants to sell to Trump in Alaska. And my guess is Putin will succeed in buying time against more pressure. I mean, it is always possible that Trump gets frustrated and says, okay, that's it. But, the U.S. doesn't have all that much leverage on Russia. They don't have a big bilateral trade. He's already raised tariffs against India for buying oil from Russia, though basically for other reasons, frankly. You can't raise tariffs further on China because they're already so high. So the amount of leverage he has is rather thin. But he wants a success. Trump wants a ceasefire. Putin wants something else. So this will be the great drama, to see who emerges from this media circus smiling more broadly.
Alex, what's in this for President Putin? Have his demands for ending the war changed of late at all? What, if anything, would Russia concede to end the war?
Well, I think the official statement from Russia was in summer last year, when Putin said that if Ukraine withdraws from the remaining parts of 4 regions Russia claims now as its own and recognizes them as part of Russia, that will be the end of the war. And he said that's not just a ceasefire, but the end to the war. Plus, of course, NATO, non-membership of NATO and language rights for the Russian speakers in Ukraine and so forth. So basically this is the baselines. The Russians haven't, all other suggestions were just speculation. Nothing came out from Russia officially. So that's the baseline situation. They might compromise on the ages, perhaps, but I think the core thing that they will not compromise is, of course, the possession of Donbass, because that's where it all started in 2014 in Slavyansk, which is the Russia is closing on now, and I don't see how it can agree not to have Slavyansk at the end of it. So, and to be honest, as report said, the military momentum is on the Russian side, and if he doesn't get it through diplomatic means, I think the Russian leadership is quite confident they will get it by the force of arms. So in that sense, Putin is in a comfortable position to go into this meeting.
Anatol, is President Trump really willing to, as he said, walk away if he deems that Putin isn't serious about making a deal? Is he, as NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte says, just making sure that Putin is serious, and if he's not, it'll stop there? I mean, in that case, what's the point?
Well, I think Trump is quite capable of walking away. The question, though, is on what terms. If he walks away and continues, well, at least to allow the Europeans to buy US military equipment for Ukraine, then the war continues. But as we've heard, it is now going Russia's way, although slowly. But if, of course, Trump ends military supplies to Ukraine, even those bought by the Europeans, then the Ukrainians will be in really serious trouble. But we will also have to see what happens on the battlefield. If Russia can capture Pokrovsk in the course of the next few days or weeks, then it could be that the Ukrainians will decide that things are going so much against them that it makes sense to withdraw from the rest of the Donbass and make a deal. They will not, however, under any circumstances, withdraw from the rest of the other two provinces that Russia has claimed. So a key question is whether Russia is prepared to abandon that demand, or at least leave it for future negotiation. I mean, the biggest concession that Russia is making, if you like, at the moment, it seems, given the way the war is going, in return for stopping the war, is stopping the war and giving up the chance, which the Russian generals at least seem to believe in, of a much greater Russian victory.
Stephen, what do you make of that? I want to get to the bottom of whether Trump is actually prepared, do you think? I mean, the first few questions that I was asking were on that theme. Given the haste with which this summit was organised, will Trump have been properly briefed on how to deal with President Putin in moral, historic, strategic terms? Will he once again wing it as the great deal maker that he is? I mean, Putin is a skilled negotiator. He has a strong command of detail. After the cuts to the National Security Council early in Trump's presidency, the second term, does Trump have any Russia and Ukraine specialists at hand to advise him?
Well, those are complicated questions. Trump does believe in his magical powers of getting into a room and negotiating. And part of the problem is, as a businessman, he still sort of sees this as a real estate deal, that it's about territory, when in fact it's about, as we know, much more. It's about the Russian world, it's about civilizational states, it's about the sovereignty of post-war borders, it's about all these things that Trump doesn't especially care about, but the Europeans do. Now, Trump does understand that Zelensky has difficulties. He understands that Putin wants something from him. I think he understands that Putin sees Trump as his best instrument for getting more out of Ukraine. So, as I say, I suspect Putin will come to Alaska with a more attractive offer than what has been revealed so far, which will be very tempting for Trump, because Trump would like to come away from this saying, you know, we've made a lot of progress, we're on the cusp of a deal. The problem is Trump wants a ceasefire. I think legitimately he wants the killing to end. Putin wants something else. Putin doesn't care about a ceasefire. Putin wants Ukraine as a vassal state outside NATO with a small military. He wants Ukraine to be like Belarus, and he is quite convinced he has to prevent it becoming like Poland. So these are bigger aims that I think go beyond what Trump understands. Now, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, you know, is quite a sensible fellow, and I'm sure has important things to say to Trump about Russia's aims. Steve Witkoff, his envoy, seems more enthusiastic about what Putin is and what Putin offers. And then I do fear, beginning even in 2017, that basically Trump sort of accepts the Putin narrative that Ukraine really is part of the Russian world and really isn't a full-fledged state somehow and shouldn't ever be part of NATO. So is Trump a neutral mediator? It's not clear. And it's not clear how much he understands of what Putin wants out of this war.
Alex, what does Putin want out of this war? How desperately did Putin need this summit? Having tested Trump's patience of late, is Putin perhaps merely playing the game here by agreeing to this summit? What's in it for the Russian president?
Well, you had 3 years of war when the West, and European Union, and United States jointly threw everything they had at Russia in terms of sanctions, in terms of weapons supplies, in terms of military assistance to Ukraine. Moscow sees it as they withstood that pressure. Now there is a new administration in Washington, which is the most likely one to do a deal which Russia would like. So why would not try to see how far they can go with Trump in that respect, particularly since, as I said, the issue on the battlefield is going Russia's way. It's in strong position there. There is much less unity in the West between the United States and the European Union. And Trump has a very different approach to it. He's not politically wedded to this conflict the way Biden was and the way the European politicians still are. So this is the best opening Russia can have with the United States administration, and it would be kind of strange that they wouldn't take this chance to see how much they can get through diplomatic means. That's the Russian position. I think it's a reasonable bet they can get something from Trump. Not that to say that it's necessarily will be acceptable to Europeans or the Ukrainians, but. And I think, thinking about ceasefire, it's Russia has the only pressure it has is the military pressure. European Union and for its part, and kind of West more generally, has the biggest pressure is the sanctions. So European Union wants to just impose more and more sanctions to see when Russia cracks. Russia will keep going until see when Ukraine cracks militarily. So at this point, Trump comes in and see maybe there is something to be done. And I think, reasonably speaking, if you look at what's happening on the battlefields, Ukraine probably might be actually, advised to actually consider Russian proposals a bit more carefully than they do at the moment.
Anatol, to what extent is now the most opportune for both Moscow and Kyiv to strike a deal?
Well, as Alex has said, things are going against Ukraine on the battlefield. On the other hand, you have to recognize that Russian advances are still very slow. And the places that they've taken in the Donbass over the past year have not been great cities. They've been small towns, which places on the Western Front in the First World War that nobody had heard of until the war broke out. And of course, Russian casualties have been very high. Russia can probably take the whole of the Donbass if it keeps going and going. But the other territorial demands that Russia have made may well be actually beyond Russia's strength. Certainly, completely defeating Ukraine and occupying Kyiv looks quite impossible. So Russia does have an incentive to get the best deal it can and end the war, as long as it gets its basic conditions, of course, one of which is Ukrainian neutrality. Now, in one way, that's a non-issue because, after all the Western governments, all the NATO members have made clear that they will never fight to defend Ukraine, which makes NATO membership an empty idea anyway. But the question is, of course, would Russia be satisfied with a statement to that effect from Trump, or will Putin demand something which will be much more difficult, which would be a constitutional amendment by the Ukrainian parliament and a formal statement from NATO itself ruling out Ukrainian membership? If that's what Russia demands, well, that will be very, very difficult and the war will go on.
Stephen, I need some Trump translation here. On Saturday, President Zelensky said that Ukrainians will not gift their land to the occupier. But on Monday, Trump said, I quote, "There'll be some land swapping going on. I know that through Russia and through conversations with everybody, for the good of Ukraine, good stuff, not bad stuff, also some bad stuff for both." What on earth did he mean by that?
He has in mind territorial shifts, there's no question. The big difference is Putin has said the ceasefire, at least his position going into Alaska, is a ceasefire is conditional on Ukraine handing over the rest of Donbass, including territories Russia does not occupy. The Ukrainian and European position has been blunt and said, no, the ceasefire has to come first before we talk about any territorial changes. So that has to be resolved first. I mean, one can imagine very easily, I mean, a lot of the Donbass is kind of ruined. One can imagine little bits of movement, but there's also some confusion about what Putin wanted. I mean, Witkoff understood him to say, okay, there's the Donbass, but in southeastern Ukraine, particularly in Zaporizhia, we would either fix the battle lines in a ceasefire, pull back a bit, but others think Witkoff misunderstood him and that Putin also wants Ukraine to hand over these regions as well, including the big nuclear power plant that Russia currently occupies. So there's a lot left to be seen. But in general, I think Trump is just saying, I think the war can end. There would have to be territorial compromise a bit on both sides. But how to get there, I think there's a great deal of disagreement.
Alex, feel free to comment on anything you've heard so far. Will Ukraine, regardless of what its European allies say, be forced to concede territory in return for peace? I mean, militarily, as we've established, it cannot defeat Russia. What would a negotiated settlement look like? And what about security guarantees for Ukraine? Is President Zelensky right to be frustrated when he asks, what's the compromise? Will we be in NATO? Probably not, from what's been said here. Will we be in the EU? He said that he hadn't heard anything, a single proposal that would guarantee that a new war wouldn't start tomorrow.
Well, I think there's been kind of a problem dilemma for Ukrainian security for a long time. What is best way, kind of how to man the security, be a neutral state. I mean, by the way, they only become constitutionally committed to NATO only in 2019, so only 6 years ago. So it's not kind of beyond imagination changing constitution back to what it was before that change was made. The other thing is that, as Anatol correctly said, that nobody wants to really fight in Ukraine, directly with Russia. So security guarantees, in that sense, the way Zelensky imagines them, that somebody will actually commit to fight Russia over Ukraine, extremely unlikely either. European Union is a completely other thing in terms of, because I think we will leave it to Europeans to decide how they can actually square the circle of, Ukrainian membership and continuing various programs like, common agricultural policy and other things. It will be a big political issue, not so much for Russia, but for Europeans to explain how Ukraine can be fitted in that. So bottom line is that, obviously they would like to have security guaranteed by NATO, membership of the European Union, and Russia paying, reparations and so forth and being punished somehow. But, bottom line is that, Russia is kind of advancing on the battlefield. This is its strongest card. It doesn't have any economic pressure it can put. It can't sanction the United States or European Union, or the only thing it can put pressure on is on the battlefield. So the last thing they will agree to is a ceasefire, before other things being put in place. And for Ukraine, this is a dilemma because they're simply not, the dilemma is how long they can hold the line. And it doesn't look like that they are, can hold line for another few weeks, for a few months. Very doubtful if we can hold it the way they've been doing it for another year. So the time pressure is on Ukraine. It should really agree to some form of deal while the front is holding, basically. And domestically, things are not looking good for Zelensky either. So there's lots of pressure, but I think. Bottom line is that you will have to have some form of negotiated settlement, which will have some form of recognition for the Russians' gains in this war, and it's very hard to imagine how it will end otherwise.
I mean, the question, and perhaps this is one for Anatol. Do you think that Trump will actually, if he thinks that Putin is playing for time, is not serious about peace, do you think that Trump will implement these sanctions, and will they make any difference?
Well, that's the problem. We've seen a huge crisis blowing up between America and India over these tariffs against India, which has really severely damaged a key US partnership in Asia, indeed the key partnership almost, which has caused deep, deep disquiet in the US foreign and security establishment, which of course is very anxious to prioritize China. So no, it's not at all clear what extra pressure the US can bring to bear, given that obviously US troops for Ukraine have been totally excluded. I mean, Trump may walk away, but my sense is then that you will see further Russian advances on the battlefield, and you will see then a resumption of talks some way down the line. By the way, I mean, on guarantees, something we haven't talked about is this Russian demand for Ukrainian demilitarization. Because, I mean, if that only meant excluding, for example, the supply of long-range missiles from the West to Ukraine, that is practicable. But if what the Russians are asking is something much more, which is to render Ukraine basically defenseless, then, of course, that's not at all acceptable, because the only real practicable guarantee, it's not a guarantee, but a security for Ukraine in future, is that it should retain strong armed forces of its own, and that the West should go on supplying those armed forces. Because you do have to remember, of course, that while the war is now going Russia's way, to some extent, it certainly hasn't gone the way that Putin expected and the Russian army expected when it first invaded Ukraine. Indeed, the entire army with which Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 has basically been destroyed in terms of both men and equipment. So if Ukraine can maintain strong defenses, that and Russia can get what it regards as its most basic conditions in Ukraine, there would be a strong disincentive, I think, for Russia to resume the war.
Stephen, very briefly, we've got under a minute. To what extent is perhaps the best that Ukraine can hope for right now a frozen conflict where somehow a ceasefire is implemented, but peace negotiations, a final settlement, goes on ad infinitum?
Yeah, well, look, I think what everyone wants, Ukraine and Europe wants Trump to do is to put pressure on Putin, who thinks he's winning the war, to understand he's gotten as much as he's going to get. Now, that would involve economic pressure, threatening to give Ukraine even more arms, longer-range missiles. If he can get across to Putin enough is enough and have a ceasefire, then we're in business, because then at least the Europeans who Trump wants to defend Ukraine and to secure it can begin to pour more weapons and money into Ukraine, as long as there is a defensible ceasefire line. If it ends up like Cyprus, that's better than a bad deal for Ukraine.
Gentlemen, there, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it. Many thanks indeed, Anatol Leven, Stephen Erlanger, and Alex Titov. And thank you for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. From me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. We'll see you again. Bye for now.
Don't miss out, get the full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news and expert insights. Like, share, stay ahead.